If you've been following our channel, you've heard us talk a lot about traditional Christianity versus modernist Christianity. And we've got a pretty good test if you want to figure out, do I have a traditional Christian worldview or do I have a modernist worldview? And you can find this out just by asking yourself, do I agree with Paul or do I disagree with Paul when he says, every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head.
Welcome to The Sacred Life. I'm your host, Aaron Beachy, and we are coming to you again today from the backwoods of Indiana. Like, there may be a couple trees nearby, a body of water, a field or a power line, something
Well,
like
don't
that.
tell too much.
Don't give away all our secrets.
But anyway, the wonderful landscape of Indiana, which all three of us love, by the way. It's near to our heart. But today we have with us again John Baylor and David Baylor, and we are discussing today the subject of the head covering or the veiling. The terminology will probably be part of our discussion today, but David, get us started.
So me and John, we grew up in a Mennonite church. I think the best way to describe its relationship to the head covering is a lot of people kind of were ashamed of it. And, maybe had seen it as something they grew up with, but felt it as like some kind of oppression or something like that. So, like we would have heard a lot of stuff growing up about how, it's not right to make women do this or something like that. But then at the same time, there were also women in the church who obviously disagreed with that and wore a head covering. I think some of them still do. So that's just kind of our background growing up, our relationship with the head covering. For myself, I'd say I always had this impression, and John shared a story with us beforehand about our dads, I guess, having a similar idea that like it's not, there's something wrong about the sort of objection that people have, because you do have this sense of it that, well, there's something real about it, something valuable, something meaningful going on there. But then on the other hand, there's this tendency for people to reduce it to, I don't know, I guess you would just say like a requirement and a rule that you have to follow, or maybe like a measure of your holiness or your commitment to the cause or something like
Yeah,
that.
but what our dad said in particular was that he wouldn't have started going to that church if they required the head covering, because he was married and he just thought, I don't want to subject my wife to this new rule that's going to affect all of her life.
Mm-hmm.
So we wouldn't have gone to that church if they required the head covering.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad was content with that, and that some kind of anniversary celebration or something for the church, there was a woman who was there who was not attending the church, but who was delivering some kind of little speech that she gave about how she was the first woman to not wear the head covering, and how that started the trend, and then everybody started getting rid of them after her, really taking credit for this big movement. And Dad said it really left a bad taste in his mouth. So he had these kind of conflicting views of like, I don't really like the idea of subjecting women to this and making this a requirement and a law that must be followed, and yet the spirit that rejects that, I also don't like.
Yeah.
The spirit that says like, like we're strong and independent, and we can do what we want, and like you say, sign of oppression and all this, we're gonna throw off these shackles, and be strong, independent people. That also seemed like not the right attitude to him.
Yeah.
Right.
I think, the two of you, your experience with the church you grew up in was my experience was the complete opposite end of the spectrum. My experience in the church that I grew up in, the Mennonite church that I grew up in, would have been that you were looked down upon if you did, and it was a requirement to be a member of the church. So much to the extent that the relationship often that was there, that existed within the church, was like, David kind of mentioned the aspect of it was what I would describe as an unhealthy relationship. A relationship that most women wore it because they were compelled to wear it, or because they felt as though they were required to wear it, and did not have a healthy relationship, in that they did not understand why they wore it, or what it was for, or the benefits behind it.
And you mentioned, sorry if I'm interrupting.
No, you're fine.
You mentioned how people look down on people who wouldn't do it or something like that. And I don't want to get too far into this, but what that makes me think of is when people act that way, it demonstrates that at some level they have a very uneasy relationship with the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like if I see the need to impose it on others, like I think a lot of time that comes from a place where I'm not actually quite convinced of it myself. But the way that I keep myself from acknowledging that is by being like the biggest champion of the thing, or by like attaching some kind of disproportionate value to it.
Right. And oftentimes when there are others around us doing the same thing that we ourselves are a little unsure of, we can go along with it because others are participating in it too. On a level that is basically, I would say, absent of understanding, or absent of a healthy relationship with it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's my experience. You mentioned your dad's words on it over the years. My experience with my father was that my dad was actually a very gracious man with my mom. My mom. Oftentimes, I'll put it this way: oftentimes, a woman will face an intense struggle with it, especially in those types of circles that I grew up in. And my dad was always very gracious with my mom. He would be like, she'd be like, "Should I wear it like that?" My mom would ask questions: "Should I wear it like this? Should I wear it like that?" And my dad would often be like, "Honey, that's not what matters." And he would encourage her a lot. So, from my perspective, my dad was very, very much, I would say, amiable with it, and had maybe actually, come to think of it, probably the most healthy relationship I've ever seen a lot of men coming out of the Mennonite church have with it. Because he looked at it in a little bit different way. But yeah, that would be, that would be my experience with it as well. And, I think, us sharing our experience with it leads to a couple questions. And one question in particular is, why has it morphed into, especially in Mennonite circles, why has it morphed into a very legalistic thing on many fronts? And why has it ended up there, and what's missing from the equation?
Yeah, hopefully we can focus on the what's missing part of it, because one thing that I see, well, I guess I should just add a little bit of my own experience before I get to addressing that question. When I went to college, in spite of going to the church where it mostly wasn't a practice, I went to a Christian college in a small town, Taylor University, and there were a lot of churches around there that I was really frustrated with, just feeling like all these churches are just trying to be cool to get the college kids to come to them. And it's like everything kind of felt like a smoke and mirrors, kind of like illusion, advertising kind of illusion, where we'll try to rope you in, but that's all that we care about. That's all that we know how to do, and that's all we want to know how to do, is just to rope people in. And in feeling some of this kind of frustration with seemingly all the churches being that way. And I thought that was just a little college town kind of thing, but then sometimes you explore other churches and you kind of feel like, oh no, they're all that way wherever you go. But I had this Zanga site, which was a blog posting site, and this was like just a couple years before Facebook. And I regretted that like the blogging culture that was developing at that time died out, and you wound up with something shallower, which was Facebook. Although my blog was mostly just like little humorous stories that I would make up and put on there. But one time I wrote this thing on there about how I wish I could just find a church where the women wear head coverings and blah blah blah, and I made a couple other comments about it. And my dad was reading that, and he said he was surprised to see that. And I felt like I had to explain myself, and I couldn't exactly explain it because, again, I didn't go to a church where most of the women were wearing head coverings, so it wasn't really part of my background. But in my mind, like, somehow that represented the alternative to what I was seeing in the churches that I was visiting. And it would be even hard for me to explain now, but like impossible for me to explain when I made that expression of like why that seemed like such a fitting symbol. But I mean, you have in the symbol, you have that humility and reverence, like a kind of stillness that's encouraged or inculcated by the head covering.
Right.
So again, I don't have a really tight theological explanation for why I said that, but like just the kind of gut feeling was like this represents the alternative.
Yeah. Okay, David, what do you think about that? Like, what is missed? Why has in many well, okay, let's look at it this way. We have had, from our background, we come from the Mennonite background, all three of us, different variations of it. In Mennonite circles, the movement, for at least our lifetimes, has been somewhat moving away from the head covering because there's a kind of a nasty relationship with it. In other circles, there's kind of a slow movement towards it.
I think it's kind of crazy. Like if you get online and you look at YouTube, like you can. I've seen a couple of these recently from Orthodox women, but I've mostly seen this from traditional Latin Mass Catholics. Young women, like they may be in their 20s or early 30s or something, and some probably even a little younger than that, who have joined the traditional Latin Mass church, and there's a practice, the liturgical practice is that the women wear head coverings during the service, and it's not in the like kind of strict legalistic system that you would be used to. But it's a practice. I mean, it's like, lighting candles for prayer or something. It's not like somebody's gonna shame you because you didn't light a candle to pray, before you went into the church service. But it is something that they do.
Well, I'm going to interrupt you there a little bit because it's interesting because there are people who will shame you if you do light candles. And like Aaron mentioned, there are some people that will shame you if you don't wear a head covering. But I think in the broader Christian world, there's a lot more people that will shame you if you do, right?
Yeah.
Like for the same reason, actually exactly the same reason why they would shame you for lighting a candle when you pray.
Yeah, right. So but you can get online, you can see all kinds of videos from young ladies who are like, I didn't know what to think about this practice. And eventually I decided, I'm going to try it. And I started wearing the head covering during the Mass and just loved it. I mean, just was a wonderful experience. And I mean, they would, a lot of them, it seems like, will describe this kind of like sense of focus. And they'll have like the veil that will drape over the sides of their heads a lot of times. They would, I guess that focus, like singleness of mind. That they would have, like, this is a time for me to pray and to be in the presence of God when I'm here. But they would have, different people would have different explanations and responses and all that. But it's very interesting to me to see, because when I see those videos, I think like this is the way people should feel about this, and not the way that so many of the disillusioned Anabaptists feel about it, which is just like this is just something that I was forced to do all the time. Well, and who knows why.
And I would give an example of that kind of, you use the word disillusionment. You mentioned you mentioned the description of a woman veiling her head, coming down the sides of her face, and, basically covering her entire head of hair and everything. And that, I think, would be the kind of the almost perfect definition of a veil. In, with this disillusionment that has gone on in our own Anabaptist circles, it is morphed into something that when you look at it, you're like, interesting. I've heard a lot of people describe it as a cap or something like that versus an actual veil. And I think that's part of it, because it has kind of, there's a symbolism here to it. It is kind of morphed into like an object that is placed on your head versus thinking of it as a veil that covers you. And that is an excellent way of understanding how people have such an unhealthy relationship, is they do not have a relationship with it, actually.
Yeah. I heard an Orthodox priest, I don't remember who it was, like comment on that, on like the Mennonite and Amish kind of head covering, and like especially like the more, I don't know, the more liberal conservatives, where like there's always like this joke in the Mennonite world that's like you can tell how conservative or how liberal a Mennonite church is by how big or how small the head covering is. But like, and he was just commenting on like, you see, like you'll see these Mennonite women with like this little tiny thing on their head, and like his comment on that is like, that's not a veil. That's just legalism.
Yeah,
like it's meaningless.
Yeah,
it serves none of the function that the actual scriptural symbol serves.
Yeah,
it's like the only reason you're doing it is because you think you have to,
right?
But you don't have any understanding of it, so it's not actually like, it still is kind of, but barely like serving the purpose of the veiling.
Yeah.
I think that's what I was going to add. Is like it still is kind of, I've mentioned singing in the Messiah before at First Mennonite Church of Bern, and there's a lot of different people that sing, and not all of them are Anabaptists or conservative, but most of them are. But they'll come from all different traditions, and so you get like this wide variety, because every church group has their own style of head covering, and my dad's really interested in that, and he'll always be able to identify everybody, what church they're a part of, by what kind of head covering they wear. I'm not all that interested in that, but
I went to a Mennonite Bible school, so I'm well versed in that.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah.
But still, to me, like, even when they got the small little cap thing, when you got all these people, they're dressed nicely anyways. When it comes time to the performance, they've all got the white shirts and their dresses on and all this, and the guys dressed up in their suits and everything. So it's a nice looking group. But like, just even the little small cap of a head covering, then I see that in the performance and just think like, man, it's just too bad there aren't more people that do this.
Yeah.
So it's something. I wouldn't dismiss it entirely, and I'll try to speak maybe to like why I would feel that way about it. Because I try to think about like, why do I care about this issue?
Yeah, John, why?
No, it is a curious question, because you could care because you just want to enforce rules, like you want to put women in their place or whatever, like,
or
so,
like you're afraid of violating the law.
Yeah, right, right. So you could have all those kind of motives about it, and I think you could say there are like some valuable meanings, which we can talk about as we progress through the conversation, that it has. But I think for the most part, like, I just look at it and think there's something beautiful there, and that's why I want it to exist.
Yeah, I think that's a good pivot, like back to the question you asked at the beginning, or like the point you brought out at the beginning about like, this indicates kind of your philosophy. Like, do you have a modernist or even a postmodernist philosophy that you're applying to your Christianity, and how you understand what Paul says, or if you even take seriously what Paul said? Just going a little bit with the conversation here, that you go to a lot of Orthodox churches, and you'll see, depending, I don't know, it depends a little bit on the jurisdiction and also just the local culture, but you'll see a fairly significant portion of the women covering their head in some way. Usually it's considerably more than I've ever seen any Mennonite or Amish woman. Like it'll be like a cloth wrapped around.
Mhm.
Like what you think of like when you see, somebody like dresses as Mary for the nativity or something like that.
Mhm. Yeah.
It'll be that more like that kind of covering usually.
Yeah.
It's far more prevalent among converts than it is among those who were raised Orthodox.
Yeah.
And like what you hear from a lot of those women is like, I don't even understand it, and like I'm not doing it out of some like that I feel it's necessary. It's just like I feel like it's right,
Mhm.
and it feels right when I do it. Which, if you're a modernist, you hate that explanation.
Right.
But that's really the best explanation, like for doing things. Like you have a deep understanding of things that your rationalism can't capture.
Right.
Our modern world abhors that and says like, well, if you don't understand it, then you shouldn't do that. And I heard that a lot as a Mennonite. Like, well, if you don't understand it, why are you doing it?
Right.
Why are we doing these things that we don't understand? It's like, well, you're a Christian. You don't understand Christianity. So your argument falls apart.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's just not a good way. That's not a good way to live.
I'm glad I didn't use that way of thinking when I was a baby, because I did not understand what's the importance of breathing and having your heart beat and eating.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the Bible, like that sounds funny, but the Bible uses that kind of language. It's like, you do compare your religious life to things like breathing.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So another question that arises, and this, how does one who comes out of basically an environment where they have had a very unhealthy relationship, they've been compelled to, or they've felt as though it's been pushed on them their entire life.
Mm-hmm.
How does one's relationship of it or view of it become transformed? And obviously, Christ is at the center of that. But there's something about, John mentioned this, there is something about observing these young women who are participating in the Catholic Latin Mass, who are triumphantly sharing their experience with it, and they're joyful about it. They're enjoying it. They're reveling in the spiritual fruits of it.
Yeah.
And that's something, quite honestly, that some people from our background can't even comprehend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how does one, how does that become transformed?
I think the first thing I would say is I'm actually going to borrow. Part of what we want to do here is redeem our own Anabaptist heritage and redeem the good. So I'm going to borrow from Wilbur Marpeck, and he's talking about the sacraments, and he's objecting to like the Calvinists and the Zwinglians. I don't know if it would have if there would have been I don't know. I don't remember the time frame of this. I don't know if it was Calvinist or Zwinglian at this point. Anyway, that's beside the point. He's objecting to these Swiss Protestants, and also I think there is some of this going on within his own ranks of people who say the Catholics have all of these sacraments, and it's just this abuse, and so we need to throw those all away. And what he says is that's the worst possible thing you could do. Like, you don't, just because somebody has abused something, it doesn't, like if it's something that's God given, that doesn't have any effect on the thing. And like I think he even goes as far as to say, like, if you're in the mass, it doesn't matter if the priest is himself doing it, like in the sense of abuse. Like what matters is the sacrament. And I think he borrows that from the fathers. Like there's whole ecumenical councils on that. Like that's not like the only question, but they deal with that question. Like if priests are abusing the sacraments, what do we do about it? The answer is the sacrament has nothing to do with the priest. It's the sacrament is God working. And so the point I'm getting at, I'm belaboring it a little bit, is I tend to do that. Sorry, is if you've experienced abuse of this thing, that doesn't destroy the dignity of the thing. That doesn't destroy the meaning of it. And I don't think the right response is to throw it away and want nothing to do with it anymore, because that's bad logic, because people have done that with the gospel.
We're living in a church age that is very much that defines this church.
Yeah, right. But we're living in a culture that defines the culture. Like the whole new atheist movement that's thankfully dying out in a rather dramatic fashion right now is built on that. Like these are people who have suffered. Like most of them, if you listen to them, you'll find out these are people who suffered horrible abuse at the hands of Christianity. Usually, some of them are ex-Muslims as well. But they suffered a horrible abuse at the hands of religion, and so their response to that is throw it all out.
Yeah.
And not only throw it all that, become its most outspoken opponent. It's like, okay, that's the extreme example, but that also is happening within Christianity, and it's horrible. It's demonic.
Right.
Like you should not do that. Instead, you should have what the fathers taught us, which is you don't be concerned with the people who are abusing it. That's not, that judgment belongs to God. It's not yours. Instead, I don't want to take that idea too far, because if you misunderstand what I'm saying, you can break it down into it's just me and God relationship. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is there is still a sense in which you have to recognize the thing and how God acts through it, and not how people are abusing.
Right.
I mean, that might also mean if you're in a situation where actual abuse is going on, maybe you should get out of that environment.
Yeah.
But
I think that's probably appropriate.
Yeah.
I think,
but if you can't, I mean, that's also the character of some of the saints, is they're in an abusive environment, and they learn to rely on God in that.
Right.
And like inject Christ and the Holy Spirit back into that upside down world that they're in.
Yeah.
So like,
I think, and I agree with everything you just said, by the way. Well said. But I want to go back to something John said a little bit ago about the explanation some of these women gave for why they were wearing it is that can't really, or maybe it was you that said it. I can't remember which one of you said it, but it was they can't explain it, but it's an incredibly enriching experience. And we've given the description of the shawl basically covering the entire, on the sides of the face and everything. And I'll just give a brief example of that in my own experience with my own wife. She normally wears the hanging veil that Mennonites wear, and which is fine enough. But there was a few times where she got ready to go outside. It was cold. She put a shawl over her face, came all the way down the sides of her face and everything. And I just remember thinking, there's something intensely appropriate about that. Mm-hmm. And it's like that really, and I can't really say why I would say that. But I would say my reaction.
This exists as a tradition actually all over the world.
Yeah, right. It's one of the most universal human customs in history. Right. Like it really is.
And so, I mean, like my daughter has almost no exposure to head coverings. I mean, much less than I did when I was young, which we've already talked about that wasn't a whole lot. Mm-hmm. The only people that she's ever around that have head coverings are your family. And, I mean, there are times when she's playing and she'll get something that she can use as a shawl, and she'll wrap around her head. But I mean, like, I don't know where she's getting that from.
I would say from nature itself.
Yeah, right. But I mean, again, there is just something that seems very natural.
I mean,
to her,
but that's actually Paul's
like early elementary age kid.
Yeah, I mean, that is actually St. Paul's whole argument in Corinthians. Mm-hmm. Is that like this is nature itself? Like you don't need a rule to tell you.
Yeah, right.
It's like you stupid Corinthians are like, I mean, and this almost like actually gets at the modern criticism of the thing. It's like, oh, you can't like find an Old Testament commandments. Where's Paul getting this? Like, Paul's whole argument is like, you stupid Corinthians, you think you need a commandment. Nature itself teaches you this. Like, if you're in tune with the Holy Spirit, if you're in tune with just the natural order of the world, which as a modern person you are not in tune with the Holy Spirit or with the natural order, the natural hierarchy thing, which is central, absolutely central to St. Paul's whole argument, is the hierarchy of being. It's maybe not obvious if you take that passage in isolation, but if you understand who's writing this and then like read it within the context of the rest of the book, like that's what he's talking about. He's talking about hierarchy. Anyway, that's a little bit of a digression. That's his whole argument, though, is this is nature. Yeah. And the reason you're defying it is because you're living in defiance of nature. This is evidenced also by the fact that, like, you're sharing women amongst yourselves. You're doing all this horrible, immoral stuff. It's like this is part of this whole disease that's infecting your culture.
And this is a disease that's infecting our culture as well, which is like we rejected the idea of femininity and we rejected the idea of masculinity.
That defines our culture nowadays. The culture of our country and also, but to go deeper, the culture of the Western Church is a culture in defiance of nature itself. And that is why, you could say that is why, like, if you get on Wikipedia, just real quickly, I'm not sure if it's Wikipedia, but it mentioned somewhere, maybe, I don't know if it's on here or not. I saw it before we started our talk, but somewhere it was mentioned that in the West, predominantly about 100 years ago, every woman was in public with some form of covering on her head. It was predominant, and
well, like some old ladies in the South will still always wear a hat.
Well, when I was young, I mean that still actually seemed pretty normal for women to wear hats.
Yeah.
Whatever church or denomination you're a part of, probably whoever founded it taught that women should wear head coverings.
Yeah.
Pretty much. I mean, like not wearing them, even though like having this conversation seems like, oh man, we're some kind of radical weirdos and like we're on the fringes. And who would ever go for this kind of thing?
Yeah.
Before the 20th century, every Christian went for this. Really, like I said, if your denomination was founded like after the 1960s, then probably not. But if it was founded sometime before then,
or
probably
if like
they believed in that.
Or if you're like, your Christian organization had something like the Second Vatican Council.
Yeah.
Because Catholicism. I found out a lot of people don't know this. Roman Catholicism, it was required for women to cover their heads in the Mass prior to the Second Vatican Council.
What I just read this morning was that actually it was required until 1983, and then they had their new canon laws. But I don't think it was common practice at that point. But I don't. I don't know.
I was thinking, and I might be wrong. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Roman Catholics. I'm not an expert on Roman Catholicism, but my understanding was there was provisions in the Second Vatican Council that made room for the practice not being enforced.
Yeah.
So
I do want to qualify everything we're saying real quick before we move on. Is that I don't think any of the three of us advocate at any level for it being required and enforced in any way.
No, that's because it's pretty obvious that that's not how it becomes a practice anyway.
But that's also like a betrayal of the nature of a symbol if you make it into a rule.
Right. And I think that you could say that could be the mistake or the trap that Anabaptists fell into.
Well, I understand difficult with the head covering because it's like this is a symbol that does relate in some way to authority, and we'll try to talk about that eventually. Like, what does this have to do with authority? But if it's some kind of symbol of authority and the feminine submission and all this, then it's really easy to take something like that and say, like, okay, then the rule is you submit, you do what I tell you, and will be a symbol that
Yeah.
you're doing what I tell you to do.
Mhm.
So like it's really easy to turn that into a tyrannical rule.
Yeah, I want to say something about that. From my experience to modern conservative Anabaptist people, that's all it is. It's a symbol of authority and submission,
Mm-hmm.
and the order that Paul describes in that passage, which is him just like giving like a real brief glimpse of the hierarchy, but most of his understanding of the hierarchy is not present in that brief description.
Mm-hmm.
God, Christ, man, woman.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
He does mention angels, but
yeah, right.
But he doesn't put them in the same line that he does with the
Yeah.
others.
Right. I mean, there's some deep theological points going on there, but we don't need to get into that now. So there is a little bit of that aspect that, okay, this is about authority, but that is the smallest part of what's going on with that. That's almost like it's the least important aspect. I think in that case, Paul's bringing that out because he's like, you're at the point where, because everything else has fallen apart, your authority structure is falling apart, and like you need to get that back in order, but you need to get everything else back in order too.
Mm.
I think what's going on with Mennonites is it's like our Anabaptist people, because we were a people that were holding on to a traditional culture at a time when the rest of the world was not, and we held on to, like, I guess more of like a medieval worldview for far longer than anybody else in the West did. That we recognized, in the 19th and into the 20th century, that culture was changing in America in particular in a very unprecedented and dangerous way. And the response at the time was very much, we need to hold our ground, which is good. You do need to hold your ground. But the understanding is we need to hold our ground so that we can figure out what's going on and figure out how to deal with it. But then it just became holding your ground for the sake of holding your ground.
Mm-hmm.
And there was never any figuring out how to deal with it. And I think that eventually just collapsed into the holding the ground and the rules that were established. Because most of the rules among traditional Anabaptists, including the Old Order Amish, didn't exist prior to the 20th century or the very late 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
Because there was no reason for them.
Yeah.
Because there was an understanding of reality that wasn't dependent on rules.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because a lot of conservative Mennonites will say if you stop wearing the head covering, then everything else is going to fall apart.
Yeah.
And there's not to totally dismiss that, but there's a kind of like opposite truth that says if you start making a rule out of the head covering, everything's going to fall apart.
No, I would say that's an indication. If you're saying that, that's an indication that everything has already fallen apart.
Right.
And you're just desperately clinging on for life.
It's a reactionary statement.
Well, it's not necessarily a reactionary statement. It's just like an attempt. It's an attempt to hold on. But I don't know. I would say almost it's like you've become numb and callous to the fact that the world has already ended.
Yeah. Very well said. Yeah. So I guess we think about the idea of reestablishing this as a practice, and we just we briefly discussed the idea that it's very dangerous to impose it.
Mm-hmm.
I think look around you and read some of these, like listen to some of the testimonials of some of these women that are starting to allow it back into their life as a way of doing things, and you'll see that that's actually how it's going to happen. Is that it's going to happen. I want to say this the right way. It's going to happen as people allow it to be part of them rediscovering the power of Christ in their life and the world around them. Mm-hmm. And I see, David's mentioned, some of the Orthodox churches and some of the women in Orthodox churches wearing it. Some I don't know for how long it's been this way, but the Orthodox Church in the West has not for very long actually made a practice of that, but it's starting to become a thing, and it has not been imposed, and it has not even been pushed by anybody. It's that it's organically starting to come about.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there are definitely people that advocate for it.
Oh, I'm sure there are.
And you know, like there are figures out there who say, like who are somewhat critical of priests. Like I'm not one of these figures that's critical of, but there are figures out there that I've seen that are critical of priests that don't teach it.
Right.
Because like the idea is that you should teach it, and this is generally the case in Orthodoxy, and I think usually in Roman Catholicism as well, is that you should teach things, but not enforce.
Well, with this issue though, there's it does kind of feel like if you're not teaching something about it, then you're going along with the times, and going along with the times means that Paul is wrong. The whole idea that you would view the head covering as oppressive, and that throwing it away, discarding it would be like some kind of triumph or independence or something. That is like a celebration of what Paul says is dishonorable. And therefore, like in a sense, it seems like if you're just going to spend your whole priestly career just ignoring the issue, then you're kind of like complacent with like, all right, we're just gonna live in the way that Paul says is dishonorable.
Right.
It does seem like it's important to try to highlight the value.
Well, and we live in a culture that basically equates teaching about something as shoving it down someone's throat.
Right.
Like we equate that.
Yeah.
We hold those as equal in our culture, and our culture. So,
yeah.
Right.
Well, when David said like none of us agree with enforcing it, then part of me is thinking like, well, how do you define enforcing it? Because people will teach it to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's like I wouldn't agree with denying somebody communion. Because they don't wear the head covering,
right?
Or like driving them out.
No church membership.
Yeah, driving them out of their church or something like that. I mean, no church membership.
Well, there's essentially like enforcing. Like I can't imagine any kind of formal enforcement that I want. Yeah. Like I mean, even where it's like, all right, church elders, we're going to have to go after this lady here and let her know that this is not acceptable, that she's not wearing this thing. Yeah. Like I wouldn't. Even that doesn't involve a specific punishment, but to me that's like.
I have to think of like Saint John Chrysostom and his story with the Empress Eudoxia, who was up to all kinds of bad things, and one of the things that she was up to was like deep corruption in order to allow herself to live lavishly. And I think her husband, the emperor, was it Arcadius? I think it was the emperor, was just like a very weak person. But what like the thing that ultimately gets John Chrysostom in trouble is the fact that he preaches openly against the things that she's doing. But I don't believe, and it's possible my understanding of the story is incomplete, but I don't believe that he ever denied her. He's the Archbishop of Constantinople, so he would have been the one serving the Eucharist to the Emperor and the Empress. And I don't think he ever denied them the Eucharist. She's up to bad things, and he's teaching against it. And he's willing ultimately to go into exile. Because that's what happened, and she's like, "Gotta get rid of this guy."
Yeah.
So it's like you can argue about that. It's like, oh well, he should have just taken the stand and denied her and not given her the Eucharist, not given her communion, if she was up to all of this bad stuff. But it's like, but I mean, for one thing, he's a saint, and you're not. That might not weigh a lot for a lot of people, but. It is an example. It's like I think it ultimately is on a higher societal level the right way to deal with those. The the way the story plays out is then her son, and I don't remember his name, but he's the next emperor. Like the saint, he's already died at this point in exile. He's buried. His bones are buried somewhere out in the wilderness. I mean, they knew where they were, and he wants to restore the dignity and the dignity and the honor of the saint, and bring his relics basically back to Constantinople. And so part of that is like begging forgiveness for what his parents did. So it's like you see how this plays out. Like, I think that's something our culture is so often guilty of, is like we can't see past the immediate issue to see what are the effects of your action. And I think like the head covering is a perfect example of that. Is we get so fixated on what the person is doing right now, and we have to deal with the issue that's in front of us right now, and we have no consideration of how the way in which we deal with those things will reverberate for generations. And that's how we've gotten ourselves into the position we're in right now. Is, I don't know, we were frankly stupid in how we dealt with the issues over the past, 200 years.
Mm-hmm.
Chrysostom liked head coverings.
He did.
He said the woman has the natural covering of the long hair,
right?
And yet she needs to wear a head covering as well. And the reason that you would need that is because your will has to be in alignment with nature. So you've got the nature there already, but this is the thing that you do yourself.
Yeah. He's one of the he's probably like the best church father to read up, because my experience, and I might just be missing something, it's likely that I am, because there's a huge wealth of literature there, but in my experience, for the most part, when church fathers talk about it, they talk about it in passing. Like, really, it's like an illustration of something else that they're talking about, because for them it's just like a fundamental principle that doesn't really even need discussed, because like we were saying earlier, it's nature itself. Like, you don't really need to tell women that they should do this, because they understand it. That actually, I don't know, kind of brings up something that I think for me is an important part of this discussion. Is the biggest reason I think Mennonites and maybe a lot of Protestants because there are also a lot of Protestants who like understand there's something going on there, but they don't understand.
Well,
exactly.
I mean, they all before the 20th century, they all did this. This was a part of their practice.
But I think the reason why the practice degrades and falls away is because there's some fundamental concepts that you're missing from Christianity that are central to understanding those. This might sound weird, but I think one of those is the Theotokos, is Mary. Like, without Mary and what Mary symbolizes, you really don't understand the whole idea of failing.
We want to shift in this direction, and because we've kind of talked about like our experiences with it and all this, and why it's valuable, but not saying like, okay, so what does it actually mean? What is it actually saying? So go with your Theotokos, and then we need to kind of build this and give some clear explanation for those kind of questions.
Okay, first of all, we're not going to be able to give clear explanations.
Oh no! I mean, because I think part of what it is mystery.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's what I was going to say, because we're talking about the mystery here. And that's actually what the veiling signifies, is mystery. And when I mention it being a beautiful thing,
when it comes down to it, that's why I really want to see it, is because I look at it and I think this is beautiful. And the reason it's beautiful is because of the symbol of mystery and inaccessibility.
So if your understanding of the head veiling is that the woman should cover her head to show her submission to authority and to her husband, and that's your primary thing, then you've inverted the symbol into almost the complete opposite of what it actually is. Because what you're saying is, oh, Paul has this hierarchy and the woman is on the bottom of it, and that's why she covers her head. And it's like, yeah, that's a very lousy understanding. Because what's really going on is in the hierarchy, and Paul says this elsewhere, the woman is actually the most valuable element. So one way you understand it is modesty in traditional culture isn't really a thing for men. Men will go out to work. Paul talks about girding up your loins, and basically what that means is like gathering up all your clothes into one, like basically a giant diaper, and basically exposing your body because it's far more practical for doing manual labor. And men are going out to battle and giving up their bodies. Men are doing this hard work. Like that's what we're doing.
You can also think of like who is more valuable, the parent or the child?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, when the ship is sinking, who gets off? Who survives? Like who has to surrender their life and who gets to keep their life? The more valuable people get to keep their life, which is the women and children.
Yeah. So kind of what I'm saying is like the right understanding of the relationship between the masculine and the feminine is that the masculine gives himself for the feminine, because the feminine is the thing that he cherishes and values above everything else. And like Paul says in Ephesians, marriage is the symbol of that.
Mm-hmm.
And like the highest embodiment of that is Christ and the church, which is why it also makes sense when I say if you don't have the Theotokos, you don't have Mary in your religion, you can't understand.
Well, I think there's also in this, there's this idea that when you turn it into this rule for tyrants to enforce, then again you're doing the exact opposite of the thing.
Yeah.
Like you're not respecting the mystery. You're not respecting the value of the woman.
Yeah, and you're reducing.
And you say that the head covering becomes an object, but it's like,
Yeah.
well, the whole thing, the whole package, the woman, it becomes the object.
Right.
Yeah, but you're reducing the woman for something that exists to serve the man,
Mm-hmm.
which is upside down.
Yeah, right.
It's completely upside down.
Mm-hmm.
Like what I'm saying is the proper order of things is that the man serves the woman. Like that's how it should be. Like, and that's what Paul says when he's talking about the relationship between man and woman. Like he is saying, like, yeah, wives, honor your husbands, reverence and serve them. Or I don't think he says serve them, but he's saying honor and reverence your husband. Like that's basically the gist of his explanation of the duties of a wife. Then he says, husbands, love your wife as Christ loves the church and gave his life for it, which is like far more of a thing than what he gives for women.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think people get distracted by the fact it's like, oh, Paul is saying that the woman exists just to serve her husband. Like, yes, but then he turns around and says, husbands, die for your wives.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, give up everything.
Well, submit would, I mean,
Yeah.
typically that will be how you're going to translate what he says for women to do is submit, and like if you get like kind of fixated on this idea, then it's like, oh, here's the way the hierarchy works. I'm the tyrant and you submit and you do my will.
A lot of 19th century Christians did get fixated on that.
Yeah,
like,
right.
To be fair.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
The tyrant, however, does not give himself up for the subject.
Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
yeah, right.
Or for those that submit to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is like the difference. Like if you know good stories, like good epic literature and fairy tales and something like that, like the difference between a good king and a bad king is the good king gives himself for his people and the bad people sacrifices his people for himself.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's basically all you need to know.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's the same, like a good husband lays down his life for his wife, and a bad husband expects his wife to lay down her life for
But
him.
I was talking with you about Macbeth a while back, and there you've got your bad king who, like, all he has is his ambition and wants to serve himself and for everything else to be in the service of him.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not in the service of him, then it should be destroyed.
Yeah.
And that's in contrast with the former king who his desire is to to help those who are beneath him to grow.
Yeah.
Like very striking contrast, but it's like we've made the shift as a society where we've decided the people that are under me should be serving me, and like this idea that a leader's job should be to help the people beneath him to grow, or that a husband's job would be to like to help the wife to grow. It's gotten lost in that fixation on submit.
Right. Yeah. And so the way I think of the head covering is that what the head covering, one of the things that the head covering symbolizes is value. And this is the same reason why in the ancient church, like the head covering is exactly the same reason why, like it's exactly the same thing that's symbolized by the practice of the ancient Christians, that unbaptized people were not allowed in the nave of the church, like ever. And they were allowed in the narthex, and that's kind of like why church architecture develops the way it does. It's like you have to have a space for the unbaptized to be in the church. Like they're still, if they're there, they're still actually in the church. But then you have the holy place, because the name of the church is the sanctuary of the temple. Like it is the holy place. The place that only the priests are allowed to be. And then you have the holiest of all place, which is the sanctuary, like where the altar is in a church, that only the priests are there, like the priest of priests. But like all of this, what I'm bringing out of this is this is all the idea that you treat sacred things as if they are actually sacred. You don't treat them as if they're common. And what I was trying to say about men, like modesty not really being a thing for men in the past, is because like masculinity is not sacred at all, like by its nature, but femininity is. And that's why the woman covers her head.
Yeah.
Because like the masculine is the thing that's out in the world, being exposed to the dirt and the violence and the pollution and the danger, and I don't know. I guess a lot of those are just synonyms for the same two things. But you know what I'm trying to say. It's like that's the masculine. The masculine is the thing that's out in the world that's exposed.
Yeah.
And the
feminine I think I would still say like there's a type of sacredness in that like what you're describing, being exposed to the dirt and the violence and all this of the world. This is the act of Christ coming down.
Yeah.
And so like I would still apply the notion of sacredness to that. But yeah, I think still what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's like
that's sacred for this kind of exceptional reason.
Yeah, I think in the case of masculinity, the sacredness isn't in the thing itself; it's how.
Or you could also say like the king is sacred.
Yeah.
I mean, the guy at the top is sacred, but with a different character.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So that's like
the sorry to interrupt again, but like the Shekinah is the presence of God in the Holy of Holies, and that I don't know if this is biblical or if this is Jewish tradition, but that is regarded as feminine. Like what is behind that veil?
Yeah. Yeah, symbolically that seems right, because like what you're signifying there is not that in any way that God is feminine, but it's that one thing that femininity represents is holiness, is sacred. Because like our holiness for us is something that is received. It's not something we possess. And so like that in a sense puts us in this feminine relationship with God, like symbolically. And like this is why it is that you say that like every veil in the Bible is symbolically the same. So like the woman's head covering, and I've heard this, and I really like this explanation. If you think of it, not in rational terms, but in the sense of meaning and symbol, that the woman's head covering is the veil in the temple, like all three of them at once.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, just I won't connect that to mystery. You keep saying sacredness, but but what is behind that is the mystery that you approach with trepidation.
Yeah, and it's like you have this really interesting contrast in the apocalypse between the two women, and the difference between them is one of them, like, it doesn't directly say this, but I think it's understood that this is going on. It's like uncovering herself and putting herself on display. And that's the nature, like, that's, I want to, there's certain words there that I probably shouldn't use for the YouTube, you know, how YouTube listens to things.
Okay, then just
deboost them.
Bleep them out, that's fine.
But the quality of the bad woman
Mm-hmm.
in the apocalypse and Revelation, you know, that she's just putting herself on the display and doing all these shameful things with the nation, and like letting them have their way with her. And then the other woman,
That's which, since you like John Calvin so much, we were talking about a John Calvin quote, me and Aaron were before recording, and he says that's what women will be like if they stop wearing the head covering. They will be exposing their bleep.
Yeah, I think John Calvin had it wrong. I think women stop wearing the head covering because that's what they've become.
Yeah,
like, not in the most literal sense. I'm not saying
all
women are.
If we were to talk about John Calvin's quote, we would be attacking it largely. But
yes,
okay,
yeah.
Go on.
Oh, I don't know. All I have to say about John Calvin is that his understanding of the world is upside down, and that's, I think, a good rule of thumb. He gets the process backwards almost always.
I mean, go ahead and read the quote. Bring up the John Calvin quote, because actually that was sort of my comment on that. Is like he says something that has some insight into it, and it's like after he's built it up with the wrong, because his whole focus is on modesty, like following up to meeting. It seems to me anyways like here, let me set the standard for you, and you live up to the standard. But then,
because the standard is the thing that's keeping you from sinning.
Yeah, right.
Which like I said,
Anabaptists have that.
Yeah, but that's
contemporary Anabaptists have that view of.
Yeah, that's a backwards understanding of the world, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Is this the one you were talking about, John? Now, if the women go bareheaded, why not also bear this and bear that?
Yeah, right.
And the men, for their part, will break loose too. In short, there will be no decency left unless people contain themselves in respect that is proper and fitting, so as not to go headlong overboard.
Yeah, right. And so, I mean, there's a little bit that comes before that where he's talking about modesty, but he hits this thing about there will be no decency left unless people contain themselves and respect what is proper and fitting. It's like, well, that's what you need to do, is you need to respect what's proper and fitting.
Right.
And the whole, we skipped the part with modesty, but it seems like he's so focused on modesty, and it's like the part you want to be focused on is paying respect and honor where it needs to be.
And all I will say to that is, guys, we in the West have had this philosophy for 500 years now, and it's worked out exactly how Paul told us in Galatians that it would, which is all you're going to do, if this is the understanding you have of things, is rebel against it. And so, like, that's what we've been doing for the last 500 years at a cultural level, is rebelling against the strictures, against the rules, against the systems that our religions keep trying to put in place to hold us, back.
Yeah.
Because that's not how our humanity functions. Like, we need symbol and meaning. And I guess I keep coming back to that with the head covering. The head covering is a symbol. It's not a rule, it's a symbol. Those are incompatible things.
Yeah, I think part of what it means that it's a symbol also is like you are speaking a message to the whole world, to yourself as well, and to the whole world, and it is a message of mystery and sacredness and holiness and femininity and single devotion to God. And I mean, you could say like the messages that it conveys are messages for everybody that are best expressed by the woman.
Yeah.
And like what the uncovered head of the man, which we haven't addressed it at all, but like the uncovered, well, I guess the gird up your loins and like exposure to the elements and all this stuff. I mean, that kind of heads in that direction, anyways. You could say like the uncovered head of the man also expresses that like standing tall and strong and confronting the forces of evil in the world and all this. And that's a message that is for everybody. And it is best expressed symbolically by the man.
Well, so there's something really important going on, and I'm just kind of, I formulated this before, but I'm just kind of reformulating this in my mind. So at the cross, Jesus turns to the Apostle John and his mother. They're there, and he says to her, "Woman, behold your son," pointing her to John, saying John is going to, and then John, behold your mother. And some people make a big deal out of the fact that he says woman. And it is actually a big deal. And it's a big deal because what you understand is that Mary is symbolically womanhood itself. And, the church fathers understand it this way, is that the Bible uses uses the words woman and man a lot in order to signify all of womanhood and all of feminine, all women and all men as a category, as like an archetype. And part of what's going on with Mary is, I don't know, like this is really, really important. Before humanity as a whole can be redeemed, first womanhood has to.
I agree with that.
And that happens with Mary, and that's why Mary is important, is because, I was talking with somebody about this and saying to this person who's a woman, it's like, look, your femininity is far more sacred than my masculinity. And part of the reason you know that is because Christ took on Mary's flesh, and no man was involved in the process. And like this is like the fact that God is incarnate in the womb of a woman is like part of the process, is like the redemption of fallen Eve, which Eve just means woman. And so like this is deeply, deeply important. So like you understand that all women in the Bible are participating in like this archetype of woman. And Mary is like the complete redemption of that symbolically. And this is like super, super important to this idea of hierarchy and the covering. But it's just like it's so hard because, like you say, it's mystery. Like I can't really explain it. But like the reason I'm bringing this out is like I think if you start putting these pieces together, you understand why Paul says it's shameful for a man to cover his head, and it's shameful for a woman not. And it's because of these very different roles that in Christianity man and woman are playing in the world.
So
because like I don't know, it's just deeply, deeply important to understanding this symbol to understand that salvation does come through the woman.
But I think one of the most obvious ways, well, you mentioned a little bit ago, David, that, how did you put it, femininity, the feminine has to be restored, or how did you put it? I forget exactly how you put it. Restored or
before humanity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like it has to be redeemed. I think. Is
Like,
what it said.
yes.
But it's the same.
And our culture is literally desecrating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
That's why I say John Calvin has it backwards.
Yeah. I'll give a most recent
Because
example.
he's desecrating the feminine in his statement.
Yeah, I'll give a very recent example that I just encountered the other day. You know, the Super Bowl is coming up soon, and you know, one of the things that people like to talk about is the Super Bowl commercials or whatever. And I heard someone talking about it that Carl's Jr. is bringing back their commercial of scantily clad woman with a advertising a burger or whatnot, and I was like, and the people that were talking about it were, celebrating this. I think somebody used the phrase something like, "Well, America's back" or something like that. And I'm like, but that is what we have done with the feminine. Is we have ripped the veil off,
right?
And we have unveiled that which is supposed to be the mysterious.
I don't know if you guys saw this, Kanye at the Grammy.
Mm-hmm.
And his girlfriend and the horribly shameful thing that they did.
Yeah.
But then the reaction on X has been to take that image and doctor it and reverse the roles. Which, guys, I'm going to say that's the appropriate response. To show, like, Kanye abasing himself rather than abasing his woman.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, I mean, that's kind of what the man should do, is abase himself to honor his woman.
Yeah. Yeah, and so it's like this whole idea of wrenching the veil. You could just say like ripping the veil off of the mystery of the feminine. Like the veil is not. It's almost as if the veil is not to be removed, but by the power of God, or the power of Christ. In such a way that it is removed. Part of the mystery is how it is removed in and of itself, and the time and place in which it is removed.
So this is something that, some time ago I didn't quite know what to think of it, because, Protestants and Anabaptists have their certain understanding about the veil being rent in the temple. And in an Orthodox church, you have the iconostas and the holy doors that are between the people in the nave and the altar. And I just heard one like real simple explanation of this from a priest, where like a Protestant was complaining to him about this. Like, well, don't you know that the veil was rent, and so the doors are open to the holy place? So why do you have this? And his response was like, yeah, come to the liturgy, you'll see that. Like, we reenact that every time we get together. Is that, but like, in order to understand the significance of the veil being removed, you have to still have the veil.
Right. Well, and what rent the veil? And it sacrificed on the grandest level.
Mm-hmm. Right. By a man.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
Well, so I was just thinking about this. So, like me and John, and we have the Sacred Life in general, we're working towards being involved more in storytelling. And I was just thinking about this story that I've been working on for years, putting together, and me and John have talked about it quite a lot. And like, there's this sense in which this heroic character is like stopping this great evil, and it's just like I just like understood putting the story together that the only way the hero can stop this evil, and it's like an ancient evil that's been banished from the world and is returning, and it's just like one of the first elements of the story I understood is the only way the hero can stop this is by sacrificing himself. It's like the hero has to die at the end of the story. Like, there's no other way around it. Because it's like that's the only way you can stop evil from intruding into the world, is self-sacrifice. Yeah. And like Christ's sacrifice being like the highest embodiment about that. And then just thinking about how, like, I think it's Saint Ignatius who like tells maybe it's the Ephesians, in his letter to the Ephesians, he tells them, it's like, I'm worried he's in Rome awaiting his execution. Like, he knows he's going to be thrown to the lions Colosseum. He knows this is coming. And he says, like, I'm worried that you're going to try to come and stop it. You're going to try to come in and save me. I don't. Like, I want this. Because he sees himself as like, I am participating. Like, I've been given the opportunity to lay down my life and participate in Christ's sacrifice. It's like, that's what we should be doing, is participating in Christ's sacrifice. And this redemption of the feminine is central to that process. And so it's like, I almost want to say, like, you can't have Christianity without that kind of sacredness and holiness of history.
We could probably go on for a long, long time about this, because this, to me, the topic of head coverings is one that just, it reaches into like all of theology.
Yeah.
And it's something, one reason that I'm drawn to it also is because it's something like nobody wants to talk about, nobody knows what to do with it. And I'm just drawn to topics like that.
No, I think this was a good conversation, because I think we hit on like a lot of the points that I personally want to bring out, as far as, especially to my own people, Anabaptist people. Mm-hmm. It's like, look, you really misunderstand this whole thing, like both sides.
But like at the same time, you really misunderstand it, and yet like it's really, really good.
Yeah.
The message is not like, give this up. This was a
well, that's what I'm saying. Both
whatever,
sides of the debate.
Yeah. Right.
Like, you don't know what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
And if you understood what's going on, you'd have the same response as all these Orthodox Catholic converts.
And when I see those converts, and I say, like, these women have something really valuable to offer the world.
Mm-hmm. And
the women of our tradition, they could have that. Like, I mean, and I'm not blaming the women. Like, it's the fault of this tyrannical approach to religion, which is more on the leadership than it is on the women, the congregations. But still, the message today for women within the tradition is, you actually do have something that's really valuable. Mm-hmm. And if you can find why it's valuable, then you'll have something to share with the world that I think everybody else is hungry for. You don't realize the valuable thing that you have, but when you have it, people will really, really want it.
Yeah, but and also when you have something that's valuable, this is good, like, understanding that part of what I'm talking about is the feminine itself. When you have something that's valuable, you treat it like it's valuable.
Right.
And like the fathers talk about this, is like, if you have like a lot of gold and jewels, you don't just like put them all on and then go and parade yourself around it. Mm-hmm. Because you'll get robbed. Like, somebody will wait till you're around the corner and will waylay you and steal your valuables. It's like, hey, guess what's happened to women in our culture? They've put their beauty on display in a way that's dangerous. And so it's been stolen from them. Right?
And before we wrap things up, Aaron, you were kind of asking.
Actually, I'm going to real quick say that's what Paul means when he says, on account of the angels. Mm. Like, that's what he's talking about. It's like these deep spiritual principles that are at work in our. Yeah.
Just that you're kind of like working through some personal questions too, as we have this conversation, and I wanted to give you a chance to kind of return to that topic and see, like, you're asking, like, what do we do about this? I mean, I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Well, the one thing I mentioned was, how does one find restoration when coming from, mm-hmm. one side or other of the debate, like David just mentioned, and I think the question's been answered pretty well. Like, it's like, you don't start, you first of all do not start by requiring anything of yourself, mm-hmm. when it comes to pleasing someone else or anything like that. You start by, mm-hmm. you start at square one, which is developing a relationship with Christ through the church, and through that's where you start with.
Yeah.
And how do you arrive at properly holding a respect for the feminine in our culture. Well,
Yeah.
it all feeds out from one place.
Right.
And that's my answer to that. And
Yeah.
if you're in a place, I would say this to anyone listening: if you are in a place where you are not sure what to do with that, or you are possibly struggling as to whether or not you should practice or whatever, don't feel as though it is something that is a struggle that has to plague you. Or that. Don't be afraid to, don't be afraid to try it either.
Yeah.
But it is not, and never was meant to be something that is an oppression to anyone.
Right. And I think I would add to that the question of the head covering is downstream from some deeper, far more fundamental issues. And if you try to draw the line at the head covering, you're going to lose.
Mm-hmm.
It's just an inherently losing battle.
Yeah. Anything else, John? Okay. David, anything else?
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you for being with us again today. We love and appreciate your participation in these conversations. Again, the comment section is always open for your comments, your questions, your critiques of us. We appreciate your suggestions and everything. We try to be attentive to those and implement those things. It's helped us perfect what we do here, so that we can
Improve what we do.
improve. Yeah. Not perfect, but improve.
Haven't done that yet.
bring a better, I guess, a better product to you, or a better.
More valuable discussion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But again, we really appreciate it, and like, comment, and subscribe. The wonderful cliches of YouTube.
Smash that like button and subscribe button.
Absolutely.
Squish it.
Annihilate it.
Yeah.
Destroy.
And pass it on. Pass it on to your friends through just the old regular tradition of person-to-person conversation and face-to-face conversation. Anyway, thank you for being with us today, and we wish you peace in Christ.